By August of 1944, following the breakout from the Normandy beachheads in Operation Cobra, General George S. Patton's Third Army was executing the fastest armored advance in the history of warfare. They were tearing across the French countryside, liberating towns, taking thousands of prisoners, and ripping the retreating German Wehrmacht to absolute shreds. The headlines back in the United States painted a picture of glorious, unstoppable victory. But behind the propaganda reels and the triumphant newspaper articles, the Third Army was bleeding. Patton's infantry battalions were facing a dire, mathematical crisis that threatened to stop his lightning-fast advance dead in its tracks. The American Army was running out of officers. A military force is not just a mob of men with rifles. It is a highly structured machine that relies entirely on a chain of command. When that chain breaks, the machine stops working. And in the European theater of World War II, the weakest link in that chain was the junior officer. Lieutenants and captains were being slaughtered at a rate that terrified the War Department. Companies that were supposed to be led by veteran commanders were suddenly leaderless in the middle of terrifying firefights. To solve this crisis, the United States military relied on a massive, slow-moving bureaucracy. But George S. Patton didn't have time for bureaucracy. Faced with a choice between following the rules and winning the war, Patton chose to break the rules. To understand why Patton took such drastic measures, you have to understand the brutal, unforgiving reality of being a junior officer in World War II. The life expectancy of a frontline infantry platoon leader, typically a two-year-old second lieutenant, was tragically, horrifyingly short. In heavy combat, some infantry divisions saw a junior officer lifespan of just 2 to 6 weeks. This staggering casualty rate was not an accident. It was the result of American military doctrine clashing with seasoned German tactics. The ethos of the American infantry officer was, "Follow me." When a platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire, the men naturally hugged the dirt. It was the lieutenant's job to stand up, expose himself to enemy fire, read the map, use his binoculars, and coordinate the attack. The veteran German soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS knew exactly how to exploit this. German snipers and machine gunners were specifically trained to scan the American lines for the men exhibiting leadership behaviors. They looked for the men waving their arms, the men carrying map cases instead of heavy ammunition, and the men with the distinctive vertical silver or gold bars painted on their helmets or pinned to their collars. The Germans knew that if you killed the lieutenant, the green American draftees would often freeze in place, waiting for orders that would never come. As a result, the junior officers were systematically hunted. The War Department back in Washington, D.C. had a system for dealing with officer casualties. When a lieutenant was killed, the unit would radio the rear echelon and request a replacement. The Army would pull a newly minted officer from a replacement depot, affectionately and derisively known by the troops as the Reppel-Deppel. These young men were almost entirely graduates of Officer Candidate School, OCS. Because the Army needed officers so desperately, the training program was accelerated to just 3 months. The enlisted men mockingly called these young officers 9-0 day wonders. The system was a disaster on the front lines. When a fresh, green 9-0 day wonder arrived at a battle-hardened infantry company, he was often a massive liability. He had a shiny gold bar on his collar, but he didn't know the men. He didn't know the terrain. He didn't know the sound of an incoming German 8mm artillery shell, and he certainly didn't know how to survive the horrific realities of close-quarters combat. Often, these young, eager lieutenants would try to prove their bravery immediately by ordering a textbook assault against a fortified German position. They would stand up, yell, "Follow me," and be shot dead within hours of arriving at the front. The veteran enlisted men resented them, fearing that an inexperienced officer's textbook tactics would get the whole platoon killed. Patton recognized that this bureaucratic replacement system was going to get his army destroyed. He needed leaders now, not in 3 weeks. He needed men who knew how to survive. This realization highlights one of the greatest paradoxes of George S. Patton's character. On paper, Patton was the ultimate military aristocrat. He was a West Point graduate, born into incredible wealth, who believed deeply in the rigid class structure of the military. He was obsessed with spit and polish, uniform regulations, and the strict separation between commissioned officers and enlisted men. But Patton was also, above all else, a pure pragmatist. He was a killer who wanted to win the war as quickly as possible. And when he looked at his bleeding platoons, he noticed something critical. When the college-educated lieutenants and captains went down, the platoons didn't disintegrate. Instead, the seasoned, non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, would seamlessly step up, take command of the radio, and keep the attack moving. These NCOs were the backbone of the Army. They were often older men hardened by the Great Depression. They had survived the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. They knew exactly how the enemy fought. They knew how to keep their heads down. And most importantly, the enlisted men trusted them with their lives. According to the rigid United States Army regulations, promoting an enlisted man to a commissioned officer was a monumental administrative task. It required massive amounts of paperwork, background checks, medical evaluations, board reviews, and technically, an official act of the United States Congress. It was a process designed for peacetime, and it took months. Patton didn't have months. He didn't even have hours. His tanks were running out of gas, and his infantry was running out of time. So, Patton simply ignored the rules. He began driving his command jeep directly to the smoldering front lines. When he found a company that had taken heavy fire and was bogged down, he would seek out the man who was actually holding the line. The interactions became legendary across the Third Army, spoken about in foxholes and mess tents. Patton, dressed impeccably in his polished helmet and riding breeches, would stride into a muddy, chaotic command post. He would find a filthy, exhausted staff sergeant barking coordinates over a radio, and he would demand, "Who is commanding this company?" The sergeant, expecting to be court-martialed for acting above his rank, would stand at rigid attention, covered in mud and blood, and reply, "I am, General. All the officers are dead." Instead of finding a 90-day wonder to take over, Patton would reach into his pocket, pull out a pair of silver bars he kept specifically for this purpose, and hand them directly to the sergeant. "Congratulations, Captain," Patton would say. "Keep attacking." With a few words, a man who was making a sergeant's meager pay, who had no college degree and no official military pedigree, was instantly commanding hundreds of men as a commissioned officer of the United States Army. Patton authorized his regimental and division commanders to do the exact same thing. If a sergeant could lead men in combat, he was an officer, period. The War Department and the administrative clerks back at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force absolutely hated this. To the bureaucrats, Patton was creating a logistical nightmare. The payroll departments didn't know how to pay these men. The personnel departments didn't have the required paperwork to officially recognize their ranks. They sent angry telegrams and official memorandums to the Third Army headquarters, demanding that Patton cease the practice and follow proper promotion protocols. Patton effectively threw the telegrams in the trash. He famously believed that wars are fought with weapons, but they are won by men. He knew that a piece of paper from a clerk in Washington, D.C. didn't make a man a leader. Surviving a German artillery barrage and keeping your men calm under fire did. The psychological impact of these battlefield commissions on the Third Army was massive. It proved to the average, working-class foot soldier that Patton wasn't just a distant, aristocratic tyrant who cared only about uniform regulations. He recognized their blood, their sacrifice, and their sheer competence. The men realized that if you fought hard, held the line, and kept your squad alive, General Patton would personally see to it that you were rewarded. Bureaucratic rules be damned. By the time Nazi Germany surrendered in May of 1945, thousands of American enlisted men across the European and Pacific theaters had received battlefield commissions, a practice heavily championed and normalized by commanders like Patton. Sadly, the story of many of these men has a bitter epilogue. After the war, when the military downsized, the rigid bureaucracy reasserted its control. The Army decided that many of these battle-hardened officers lacked the formal education required for a peacetime military. Thousands of them were quietly stripped of their officer commissions and reverted back to their enlisted ranks. But history remembers what the bureaucrats tried to erase. General George S. Patton is remembered in the history books for his aggressive tank maneuvers, his ivory-handled revolvers, and his controversial speeches. But his most effective weapon was his absolute, ruthless pragmatism. When the United States Army bureaucracy failed his men, he bypassed the bureaucracy. He promoted sergeants in the mud because he knew a profound, unshakable truth of human conflict. The best leader is not the one with the most schooling, the shiniest boots, or the right paperwork. The best leader is the one who is still standing, still fighting, and still leading when the smoke finally clears.